Hello, I'm Colin Grant. I'm a writer and historian, author of 5 non-fiction books. All of my books have really been about African Caribbean life. And I think partly because I haven't really understood our history. When I was growing up, we knew very little about our own family history. It could be recounted in a paragraph, really. My mother used to have this mantra. Both of my parents are from Jamaica. And before my mother, there was Pauline Fredrickson, late of New York. She was a violinist and a dancer who danced in New York. And when she returned to Jamaica, she was billed thus, late of New York. She danced with the Butterfly Troupe. Before Pauline, there was Mama. Mama ran a restaurant in Panama City for the West Indian workers who built the Panama Canal. Before Mama, there was Granny Reed, and what we knew about Granny Reed was that she was a highway robber, quite a successful one, until one day she was caught and put on trial, but she flirted with the judge and was found not guilty. And before Granny Reed, there was Gong, who was enslaved. And that's it. The rest is darkness. And that's why I think I've wanted to interrogate, excavate Caribbean history, because of that absence, that perceived absence of history. And Marcus Garvey, a man I wrote about, once said that a people without a history is like a tree without a root. When I watched your local arena, Caribbean Nights, I was struck by that sentiment, because the essence of that documentary feature presented by Darcus Howe and 3 poets, Linton Kwesi Johnson, Derek Walcott and Fred de Geer, the essence of their discussion really was about voice. What is the poet's voice? What is the Caribbean voice? And who gets to speak? Who gets to voice their story? They had a fascinating discussion about the nature of voice, whether they wrote in patois or dialect, or whether they wrote in standard English. But more than that, whether they thought in dialect, or whether they thought in standard English. In Jamaica, we don't say dialect or patois these days, we say nation language. That's our language. And it was striking that when I completed my final book, my last book, which is called Homecoming, Voices of the Windrush Generation, I was very alert to the fact that many of the people that I spoke to for this oral history had not been given a platform before, had not had a voice in literature. The key moment in Caribbean life was the beginnings of independence. And in the 1960s, one of the key distractions for people in Jamaica was pantomime. I interviewed a woman called Barbara Gluden, who ran the Little Theatre, and pantomime lasted 3 months in Jamaica. And she talked about the way that pantomime changed. When she began in the early 60s, pantomime was an import from England, and it kind of replicated the kind of pantomimes that you might find in the London West End theatres, Puss in Boots. But they changed pantomime in Jamaica, and they brought in local people with local voices. And Barbara Gluden talked about a snobbish white Englishwoman that she interviewed at about that time, who said that she stopped going to pantomime when they introduced market women on the stage. She didn't want to hear those voices. But those are the real authentic voices of Jamaica. And it's very important, I think, when you're thinking about your stories, that you think about who hasn't been included. Where are the gaps, even in your own family? If you think about the story of the Windrush generation, which has been boiled down to that famous ship, the Empire Windrush. Many of the images from that moment, when those men come down the gangway in 1948 off the SS Empire Windrush, they're beautiful men in smart suits. But again and again, that image is played out over the decades, and hardly any women are represented. Now, it was often said that on that first ship there were 500 Jamaican hands. That's not true. There are 1,000 people on that ship, and there are more than 200 women. So it's important to think about the idiosyncrasy of voice, of the uniqueness of voice. I often reflect on the words of Martha Graham at this moment, who talks about her choreography. She's a great choreographer who taught many, many dancers, and she often said to them that they are unique. Every dancer is unique. Nobody looks like them, nobody has the same shape, nobody moves like them, nobody gestures like them. That's their uniqueness. And the same is true of anybody who writes. They have a unique story to tell. They have unique experiences. They have a unique way of telling that story. Nobody would write those stories in the way that you write them. So that's your uniqueness. So cling to that, hold fast to that. There's truth in that. And it's very true, I think, also when I interviewed many people for the oral history book, Homecoming. I'm going to read from Homecoming now. I interviewed about 50 people. There are about 120 people in the book altogether. There's some archive as well. And one of the men I interviewed was a man called Wilfred Lawson, who's Jamaican. And he left Jamaica in the 1950s. Like many people, he didn't have enough money to travel. So he became a stowaway. And it was important to me when I interviewed Wilfred Lawson to capture his voice, to conjure his voice, to tell the story in the way that he would tell it. Wilfred Lawson. So in 1954, I was 19. I decided to stow away on a ship called the Jamaica Producer. I never tell no one. I never told my parents, as I knew it would have put them in too much of a trance like. They would be very anxious. When we got on board, we hid behind bananas and had quite a few to eat. We were never hungry. Well, after a few days at sea, we come up from a hiding place because we knew by then they wouldn't turn the ship around. And the chief steward, a white Jamaican called Chambers, ordered me to scrub the deck. I told him, I'm not scrubbing no damn deck. Well, he took my passport and my friend's passport and he threw both of them overboard into the sea. It was important to me to convey Wilfred's story in the way that he told it, not to standardize his English or to beautify it, just to tell it in the beautiful way that he told it. And that was true of everybody that I interviewed for the book Homecoming. And it's clear to me that when you do write these stories, when you do try to assemble your book, you might use things to aid you in the recovery of those memories. For me, it was important to think about the value of photographs. And I thought this very deeply when I came across a photograph which we used for the cover of Homecoming. A rather beautiful photograph taken in 1962, when I was quite intrigued by the two people who you could mostly see, a young woman and a young man. And I discovered the name of the photographer, who himself was a young man in 1962, a man called Howard Gray. He heard there was the last boat train of West Indians who travelled from the Caribbean, who arrived at Southampton and now had taken the train up to Waterloo. He rushed to Waterloo station. It was a May day. It was a very grey day. And Waterloo had a very dark roof, very grimy roof. The floor was asphalt, very dark. The walls were grimy. And the people who came off the boat train had dark skin. Howard Gray never used flash photography. He took 3 rolls of film very quickly within 20 minutes, rushed to his studio afterwards to develop the film, looked at the negatives, and there was nothing there. Nothing had come out. He cut up the negatives, put them in the manila envelope, and there they remained for 54 years. A few years ago, he was watching a BBC television program called Click, and they talked about how you can now visualize data with some of these new high-end scanners. He took the negatives to a scanner. They scanned 3 times with highlights and shadows, and slowly up the images came. These people emerged from the darkness. The negative was made real. And I love that story because, in a way, it's a metaphor for the Caribbean experience in this country. For many years, for many decades, West Indians have been in the margins, eclipsed, invisible, and slowly they've moved from the margins to the centre. When people think about the memoirs or the life stories that they might write, they sometimes get a little bit anxious about the veracity of those memories, the truth of those memories. But I would say that there's a big difference between writing a standard biography of a well-known figure and writing a memoir. I think the standard biography, especially the historical biographies, rely on verifiable truths, facts, which can be checked. But memoir is evocation of the past. When you're writing a memoir, you're trying to evoke the past, to conjure the past to the best of your ability. There will be gaps in your memory, and you shouldn't beat yourself up about that. You just try to do the best you can, and I think that readers expect that. Because I think now we come to accept that memory is faulty. The brain is a fine instrument, but the brain recalibrates your experiences. The psychologists have been telling us from the 1930s that when you access a memory, you change it subtly with every time you conjure it. So you fictionalize your memories, small fictions every time. And this is very true, I think, of memoir writers generally. They accept this as a thing that they have to contend with. One of my favourite writers is a man called William Maxwell. For many years, he was the editor for The New Yorker for 40 years. And then towards the end of his life, he started to write his own novels and memoirs. He wrote a very fine book called So Long, See You Tomorrow, which was sold as a novel. But in fact, in my mind, it's a memoir. And he addresses the unreliability of memory. I'm going to read you a passage from So Long, See You Tomorrow. I seem to remember that I went to the new house one winter day and saw snow descending through the attic to the upstairs bedrooms. It could also be that I never did any such thing, for I am fairly certain that in a snapshot album I have lost track of, there was a picture of the house taken in the circumstances I have just described. And it is possible that I am remembering that rather than an actual experience. What we, or at any rate, what I refer to confidently as memory, meaning a moment, a scene, a fact that has been subjected to a fixative and thereby rescued from oblivion, is really a form of storytelling that goes on continually in the mind and often changes with the telling. In any case, in talking about the past, we lie with every breath we draw. I wonder what you make of that sentence, we lie with every breath we draw. I don't think we set out to lie, but we are fabricating through filling in the gaps of your memory. You might have come across this with some of your friends and relations who remember different aspects of the same story. And they will say, no, it didn't happen that way, it happened this way. And when you come to write your own story, be prepared for that. Be prepared for your siblings or your parents saying, no, you've misremembered. Or be prepared for them saying, how can you tell that story? That's my story. That's our story. And there's an element of truth in that. You're not just telling your own story. You're telling a group story, perhaps. You're telling other people's story as well. But I often say to my siblings, if they're unhappy with anything that I've written, well, that's my version. You are free to tell your own version. And as a Jamaican, I'm very keen to stress a phrase which you hear again and again in Jamaica. In fact, I think it's been colonized by President Trump. And the Jamaicans say, there are no facts, there are only versions. But how do you begin? That's the $64 million question. I don't know if there's as many millions as that, but anyway, that's a big question. And that's the thing that terrifies many, many people. You just have to dive in. And the way you dive in, I think, you start with a memory. Start with something, any memory really. You can pluck a memory. You've got so many memories at your disposal. Start with a story. Start with that memory and see how you progress. And that's true of almost any writer who I admire. I admire particularly V.S. Naipaul. He's got a few questionable positions on the depiction of black people, but actually I forgive him that because he's such a great writer. And one of my favourite books of his is a book I've read to all my children, actually. It's called Miguel Street. I'm going to read from it now. And now Paul talks about this being the first story he thought was able to be published. And he began writing a sentence when he was at work in the BBC World Service. A memory came to him, and this is the memory. This is in Port of Spain in Trinidad in the 1950s. Every morning when he got up, Hat would sit on the banister of his back veranda and shout across, "What happened there, Bogart?" Now Paul talks about that being a true memory and a true phrase which he heard again and again. And he writes about how that enabled him to begin to write because, as he says in a book called Finding the Center, which is finding the center of the story, that luck was with me that day because that first sentence was so direct, so uncluttered, so without complications, that it provoked the sentence that was to follow. Bogart would turn in his bed and mumble softly so that no one heard, "What happened there, Hat?" And that's how Paul's novel begins, Miguel Street. It begins with a sentence that he remembers, and he conjures the past with that sentence. And I would encourage you to dig in, to recall some of the experiences that may have happened in the past, which you might not have accessed for a while, but just to sit with those memories. They will arrive, sometimes unbidden, but they will arrive. And one of the things I do quite often is to play back in my mind at night time some of the things that have gone on in the course of the day. Sometimes quirky little things which you may not value at the time, but with the passage of time, when you come to write, you'll see that they have potential. So I do that all the time. So just jot things down. So you don't have to rely purely on your own memories. There are other resources for you in your own family, even from the points of view of different people remembering, recalling different aspects of the same story that you're telling. And that can be used to deepen, to add more textures, more layers to the story. But also it's quite a valuable technique I've found to ask your siblings for their memories of your particular story that you're telling. It's quite political to do so. So their story becomes part of your story. Your story becomes part of their story. So that's it, everybody. That's enough from me, enough from him. I hope you're not as exhausted as I am, but I hope you've gained something from this little survey of my own writing, some tips about how you may begin. And as my sister would say, within 2 twos of beginning to write and piecing together your little short stories, you may find yourself one day in possession of your own memoir. The very best of luck with it.